Is the Sega Game Gear actually better than the Nintendo Game Boy? Does Never Chris have the gall to even suggest such a thing after that ridiculously terrible Game Boy video? Well, by the end of this video, we will be making what I like to call the final decision. Here on the Never Chris channel, we do not wuss out in making these ultimate determinations. We will be telling you what is best. And I don't even know why I'm talking in third person here. I didn't even write this in the script in third person. I don't know what's going on with me. I would love to say that Sega splashed onto the scene, releasing a handheld system in full color in 1990 and 1991 between the US and Japan, absolutely demolishing the pitiful Game Boy, which could only display a sad gray in 3 shades of green. But that just isn't what happened. The Game Boy always stood on top. It's not even a question after the original Game Boy went on to sell 64 million units worldwide during its lifetime, with the Game Gear only selling 10 million units worldwide during its own. Luckily for the Game Gear, we don't care here about how many units were sold in determining the best of the best. Sometimes the greatest things on this planet are enjoyed only by a select, chosen few to the ignorance of everyone else. What is fascinating about the Game Gear is that for how few units were ultimately sold, people always had such strong opinions on this system. I remember conversations growing up with friends where we'd talk about which system we'd rather have, the Game Boy or the Game Gear. The Game Gear was almost always considered the cooler system, at least for the few years where the systems were going head to head, because the limited colors on the Game Boy were kind of lame. The inability to see the Game Boy at night was a major bummer, and the Game Gear just had a very nice, sleek design. Recently, when I decided to quiz my friends and ask them about the Game Gear, they all immediately knew what it was. Even the non-gamer friends were likely to remember it. They all had an opinion, thinking that it was cool tech for the time, even though very few actually had the system. Something to keep in mind about the 90s is that there were a lot of video game systems that came and went and nobody knew about them. When I was asking my friends about the Game Gear, yeah, I brought up the TurboGrafx 16, even the Neo Geo. People were a lot rougher in remembering what the heck those systems were. Video game magazines would mention them from time to time, and you might encounter a strange kiosk at Toys R Us or Best Buy, maybe, but otherwise, real people weren't buying those systems. Sega was in this camp for a while. Sega had an 8-bit system which released in 1986 that competed against the NES. You never saw this system in stores. This actually bummed me out as a child because I loved the expanded color palette and I tried to keep an eye out for any new games. The only conversations I ever had about the system is when I would tell friends about it at school as if it was this rare artifact that might as well exist within another dimension. There's only one other person I ever met at the time who knew anything about the system. The only reason I knew what the system was is because I was born into a family of strange tech enthusiasts, with my dad becoming a programmer before most people even knew what a computer was. The Sega Genesis was released in 1989. Even that system started off way behind, with not a lot of people knowing about it. It looked spectacular as compared to the NES, but who was really buying non-Nintendo systems at the time? The first time I ever encountered the system in the wild was during the summer of 1990. I had a vague idea of what it was. I had seen it in a few video game magazines, but that was it. A friend's dad in the neighborhood owned the system. My friend themselves was not allowed to play it. When I was in their home, I was not allowed to try it. I was told that I could watch my friend's dad play it for specifically 10 minutes as long as I remained completely silent. I did just that. It was very bizarre. I thought Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle looked really cool. I was never allowed back in that friend's house again. There was no drama going on, but Dad just could not handle any friends even being in the same vicinity of his video game system. I next encountered the system the following winter. My dad, tech enthusiast, decided that he was going to rent it for the weekend. I had no idea that was even an option. I really liked playing Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse at the time. Sonic the Hedgehog did not exist yet. Around this time, the Sega Genesis never came up in conversations with friends. The Sega Genesis, and thus Sega themselves, did not fully enter the public consciousness until the release of Sonic the Hedgehog 2 on November 21st, 1992. What Sonic 2 did was incredible, with such speed that I had never seen in a video game, especially in a competent platformer like this. The game and the marketing campaign is what put Sega on the map. This opened the door retroactively for Sega. Kids were not even that big of a fan of the original Sonic the Hedgehog game. Most people had it primarily because when Sonic 2 launched, the system came with both Sonic 1 and Sonic 2. Back to the Game Gear itself. Post-Sonic Revolution. Remember how I said that most kids thought the Game Gear was cooler? When it came time for them to finally get a handheld system, you know what system they ultimately got? It was the Game Boy. It was always the Game Boy. But why? If your memory is sharp, you know exactly what the reason is. The price. In 1995, when these systems were going head-to-head, the Game Boy was going for only $49.99 US dollars. The Game Gear was going for $129.99 US dollars. This massive price difference always existed between the two handheld systems. When mom and dad are picking up Christmas presents, when Nintendo is still synonymous with video games, they're already grumpy that they're buying another video game system in addition to whatever TV consoles that are in the home, and they're more likely to recognize Mario. Yeah, they went with the Game Boy. The Game Boy also has Tetris. Yeah, the friends always ended up getting the Game Boy. I had a suspicion too that some friends may have lied as well, pretending to prefer to own a Game Gear when really, deep down, they wanted that Game Boy. It's an interesting lens to think about things. It's worth mentioning that the games were more expensive as well on average, and your battery budget would go through the roof if you were looking to play this system on the go. The system took 6 AA batteries that would last 3 to 5 hours. That was it. Then the parents had to buy more batteries. When I had the system, it was generally always connected to a power supply permanently plugged into the wall. At least you could do that. Novelty fact, you could also unplug your Genesis power supply and use that to power the Game Gear. For my own Game Gear, my parents ultimately decided in buying a car charger as well, as that would be more economical down the line. Okay, it's time to talk about the Game Gear and Sonic the Hedgehog. The hype behind the original Sonic the Hedgehog game for the Game Gear was non-existent, even though we all came to love Sonic during the 90s. I remember the first time I tried the first Sonic on the Game Gear. I was bought in, I loved Sonic 2, I was reading the comic books, I pretended to love the first Genesis Sonic. I mean, I thought it was okay. And then I spotted this Game Gear game at a kiosk at Toys R Us. I was excited to finally get a chance to play it. My first impression was crap. You have to remember, most handheld games were ports of better games that you could play elsewhere. Downgraded ports always sucked when you could just try to get the real thing on a console. Sonic 1 here on the Game Gear starts you off in Green Hill Zone. It looks and feels like Green Hill Zone from Sonic 1, which most of us only pretended to love. I mean, yeah, it's pretty good, but, and it was not as good. You could tell concessions were being made to make this thing work on the smaller screen. I had no idea what the rest of the game contained, but because every single video game I got back in those days was a slot at Christmas or on my birthday, or took a massive campaign of begging and pleading very pathetically over weeks and months, this was a title I was not going to be fighting for. Also, just like the Game Boy, you couldn't rent handheld games, so there was not much of a way that I could have figured out what was actually in the rest of this Game Gear cart. In retrospect, the original Game Gear Sonic is a totally different game and does feature entirely new areas. Even for the zones that are from the Genesis version, the layouts are completely different. It's just a completely different game. And it's actually pretty cool. I just had no idea. No friends, at least as far as I'm aware, it never came up, owned the original Sonic either. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 on Game Gear came and went as well. At the time, I had no idea if this was the same or a different game. It did turn out to be a completely different game, and it's okay. I didn't get a Game Gear until the Christmas of 1993. What was the major drive? Sonic Chaos. It looked like Sega had finally put out an original Sonic game on the handheld. There was a major marketing push, and the game looked really cool, fast, exciting. Tails was there, accounted for and playable. And I was hungry for a new Sonic game. I was loving Sonic at the time, and thankfully my parents ended up getting it for me. Sonic Chaos itself was decent. I liked it a lot at first, but as I played the game recently, I found it mostly just average at best. You want to know what game I played the most on Game Gear, and this feels a little ridiculous to admit? The Majors, Pro Baseball. I've never been much of a sports gamer, but for some reason, I just really enjoyed this game. It came packed in with the system, so of course I tried it. It is simple, shallow baseball to some extent, but at its best with controls that just work. I tried all the other baseball games in preparation for this video just out of curiosity, and it's much better and more functional than the rest that aren't by Sega. I have a theory that some of the best handheld games, especially at the time, are puzzle games and more simple games that you can grind out. Sports games you can grind out just playing through a season, but we'll get back to that later. We need to discuss a sad truth with the Game Gear. The system is in color and you can play it in the dark. I loved that. I used to play this system hiding under my covers at night so that my parents would not see the light coming from the screen under the doorway. I couldn't do that with my console games. However, for the fast action games, like all of the Sonic titles, except for Sonic Labyrinth, there is a screen blur that occurs naturally. It's faint, it's subtle, hard to reproduce on an emulator, even though they try to, but it's still there. It slightly degrades everything. And for standout titles that rely on speed, it's a major bummer. So let's talk more games, because ultimately that's what's most important. I played a lot of Game Gear games in preparation for this video. There are 3 separate types of games I noticed while sampling many of these titles. You have 1. Ports of Sega Master System games. 2. Downgraded ports of other games, generally from the Sega Genesis. Number 3. Original titles. There are some real consistent themes among these categories, but first, I will say this. I just got done going through the same exercise for the Game Boy. I was surprised that title for title, when playing random ports of games, I was having a much better time with the Game Gear. The B titles, games that are ports, feel like actual video games, and I could imagine myself wanting to play them back in the 1990s. Some of these Game Boy games are barely operational. For the non-standout titles on the Game Boy, I wanted nothing to do with them. This I found interesting. Today, though, with every retro game available to me in an optimal setting, the ports are just not versions that I would ever want to play by choice, at least generally. First, let's talk about the Sega Master System ports. On average, these are the best games on the system. You see, the Game Gear technically is essentially a portable Sega Master System with the same system capabilities. There was already an established set of games ripe for moving right over to the handheld, and their main console efforts could easily port over. What's the problem then? Well, Sega had to make a judgment call, and with the smaller screen, Sega made the decision to zoom in on most of their games so that the action could actually be seen by normal human eyeballs. However, this also means that these Sega Master System games just aren't as good because you can't see as much. Depending on the game, this can harm the experience quite a bit. Sonic the Hedgehog, Sonic the Hedgehog 2, and Sonic Chaos were also Sega Master System games. I had no idea at the time, since the marketing never pushed these on the Sega Master System, and the major retailers never stocked it, but the fact remains that with all of these games, I grew up closely associating with the Game Gear. There was a near simultaneous release of a better version on the Master System. That's something that I just can't ignore at this point. Playing these old Sonic games, while they're decent games, there's a certain level of persistent anxiety you get when you're afraid of easily running into enemies. It always kept me just a little bit on edge, and I'm a pretty seasoned gamer, so it shouldn't be too big of an issue. After playing the Game Gear versions, when I then tried them on the Master System, I was astonished. These games just psychologically felt so much better, and it was easier to just sort of hang out with them and have a good time. A certain level of pressure just was not there. Even a slower paced game like Land of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse, which I really liked on the Game Gear, is ultimately more fun to play on the Sega Master System just due to technical reasons. We could run down the list of Master System titles, but I think the point is made. These games are good and that they function very well, but I specifically just don't want to play them here. There's really no point at this point. I actually found myself afraid of accidentally souring my impression of a hidden gem as I played these on the Game Gear because I knew that I wouldn't be playing them on the best system. Next are the ports from non-Master System systems, a lot of them coming from the Sega Genesis. These are better than Game Boy ports for the most part, on average, that's for sure. Mortal Kombat 2 was actually fun to play and played close enough to the real thing where I didn't feel like I was too lost. The original Streets of Rage lacked, but the second game was actually really cool. I would call this a standout good game, although, and this is going to be a controversial one, I don't think that any of the Streets of Rage games are really that fun and worth playing unless you're playing with someone else. Unless you are willing to go out of your way and have a friend that would be interested in playing this specific port of Streets of Rage, you probably won't be able to extract the best out of this anytime soon. Technically, there is a Sega Master System version of this game. However, I found the Master System version to be not as good, with the gameplay going a little too fast. Road Rash, which ends up at the top of many top lists for this system online, is technically an impressive achievement. The pseudo 3D here looks good. I could imagine myself playing this in a car in the 90s, but today, there's a PlayStation version that I have just in the other room, and ultimately, this version is rather shallow. Fatal Fury Special was pretty cool. With Mortal Kombat 2 already being decent enough, I didn't think another miracle could strike so soon and we'd get another playable 8-bit fighting game, but hey, I was pleasantly surprised to see SNK representing decently here. A lot of games did not have good ports though. Virtua Fighter Animation, which I don't know if this is considered a port of the arcade game or a port of the Genesis game, but it was rough, not worth playing. The version of Battletoads here, not from the Genesis, the NES, was rough. Double Dragon was as awful as ever. These non-NES ports are terrible. NBA Jam, which I had some hopes for, both the original and tournament edition, did not feel close enough to the real thing, and so that was disappointing. NHL Hockey from Electronic Arts, known for the classic NHL 94, had an okay version. I felt like it needed more buttons, though, to really excel. At least it was better than the sad NHL All-Star Hockey from Sega Sports. Sega, I expected better. Ninja Gaiden failed as expected. With each downgraded port I played, even with some of them being impressive for what they were, I would not want to play those games over the original, except maybe Streets of Rage 2 with a buddy. It's just another unique Streets of Rage game that's different. Alright, I'll give one concession for the downgraded ports. The puzzle games work really well here. Columns is here. It seems functional. I figured I had to at least capture some footage of it, although I don't understand the appeal of Columns, and it does nothing for me, so it's hard to be critical, but it seems to be playable. Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine, I really liked. Is this my preferred Puyo game? No, but I did have this version as a kid, and it got a lot of good usage out of me, and I never really had a desire to own the Genesis version. We have Bust a Move here. The port is pretty good. It has a pretty basic vibe to it. And there are other versions that are better, but as an on-the-go version, it's pretty good. It's serviceable and doesn't feel particularly held back. So, it's time to address the original games, which are most exciting to me. I tried really hard to find hidden gems on this system because that's what interests me the most. It was rough. Most of the recommended titles on the Game Gear that are on these top 10 or top whatever lists are just worser versions of games better played elsewhere. However, I believe it's the exclusive and unique games that really bring a system to life. I had a hard time here. We already took a look at the majority of good Sonic games. Sonic Triple Trouble is unique to the Game Gear and is probably the best Sonic game on the system. It's worth checking out, and I do recommend it if you like 2D Sonic gameplay. Tails Adventure, I was shocked. I was sure this was just going to be another terrible game. It was also rather good. It's a slowed down platformer, more suitable for the Game Gear. It's a bit more puzzle oriented, and it's a great fit for the system. I recommend checking this one out. So, what else is there? There's Shinobi, which is a decent version. It's more inspired by the Genesis versions rather than a direct port of any specific version, so I'd say it counts as original. I do think that they rushed the balance of the game though, so it's hard to call it great. Sonic Labyrinth? Okay. I'll be honest, I've yet to take the full plunge as an adult and give this game yet another chance in my life, but I hated it as a kid and young adult. Sonic Drift 1 and 2 are okay. 2 getting the only US release. I hated these games as a kid, but I gave them a real serious chance here. They aren't particularly exciting beyond the first hour, but they're moderately playable. They are not true competitors to Mario Kart, though. They're just sort of interesting novelties. I guess quick shout out to Coca-Cola Kid. It's quite good, although it never got a US release. This Mega Man game, a bizarre abomination of several NES titles, I don't even know if I can consider this a Game Gear original, but it's interesting. Is it worth checking out? Kind of, but we'll be taking a much more deeper, in-depth look at this game someday soon. There's really not that much else on this system. I am sorry. I tried some of the JRPGs that get recommended in the top lists, and man, these are some rough old school titles that I can't see anybody playing in this day and age. And I say this as a person who routinely goes back and plays old JRPGs. Axe Battler, A Legend of Golden Axe, was hyped as this interesting Golden Axe spin-off that plays like Zelda 2. I mean, yeah, it seems to lift quite a bit from that game, but it's not actually good. It has poor hit detection, and some of the random battles will just start happening every time you move one space. It is ridiculous. There is no way that game is actually anyone's favorite game. Okay, and Dragon Crystal, seriously, that's what's also getting recommended. It's a slow, sludge-filled, plodding mess. It is so dull. Okay, full disclosure. There are a small handful of big-name JRPGs for the Game Gear that might be good that got Japanese-only releases and then later enhanced ports to other systems. There are 2 Japanese-only Shining Force games that got ported to the Sega CD together as Shining Force CD, which did also get an English release. I like Shining Force 1 and 2 a lot, and this seems in line with those titles, but there's no way that I'd actually want to go the distance with the original Japanese Game Gear releases at this point, so I skipped them. There's also Lunar Walking School, which got a release in 1996 on Game Gear and then on the Sega Saturn in 1997. The Game Gear version has a fan translation, so it's a little tempting when there's no English version of the Saturn version, but I really just don't want to play the Game Gear version of an RPG like that at this point. I think I'd rather stumble through the Japanese text, all things being equal. There's also a version of Last Bible, a spin-off in the Shin Megami Tensei series, but I'm already a million spin-off games behind on that franchise, and this version doesn't look to particularly stand out. Another topic, rather interesting, mostly for another video, so I'll only touch on it here, is how with Game Gear games, using emulation, you can actually enhance these games quite a bit. You can switch the emulator into what's called Sega Master System mode. This zooms out the screen primarily in platforming games and is really cool. However, depending on the game, the screen glitches can get pretty bad. For the Sega Master System ports, there's no reason in doing this because there's actually just a Sega Master System version that you could play instead. However, for Sonic Triple Trouble and Tails Adventure, exclusive games worth checking out, this would have to be my preferred way of playing these games. There's also an entire ROM hacking community that occasionally will make patches for these games to reduce the graphical glitches, which is really exciting. I don't know if we could really consider ourselves to be playing pure Game Gear games though at this point after such modifications, but it's interesting to touch on, although we are sort of working around the system at that point. So, if this was the 90s, I could have only one system. I'm the shallow-minded jerk that I was at the time, and we are pre-Pokemon Fever in 1998. Hell yeah, I'm going with the Game Gear. The backlit screen, ability to play at night without my parents ever knowing, and cool, interesting ports, I am digging it. As a kid, I played more Game Gear than Game Boy, at least during the early and mid-90s. However, there are more good original Game Boy games. Mega Man 5 is cool, Metroid 2 is a classic, Super Mario Land 2 is good, Link's Awakening is really cool, the Final Fantasy games are worth checking out, Tetris is still the best puzzle game, Kirby's fun, Donkey Kong 94 is great, games like Quirk work really well on a handheld, and there are some other pretty good games. The good original Game Boy games do outnumber the good original Game Gear games, are oftentimes better, and that is what I consider the most important. Of course, too, then there's Pokemon, which is the perfect style of game for a handheld. Ultimately, for the standout Game Gear games that I recommend checking out that are good, that are worth playing, none of them are going on my top games of all time list anytime soon. I like hidden gems, and so they're exciting in that way. I actually like checking out games that are only kind of average but are weird and interesting. That's sort of just me, though. With that, it's time to make our final decision. It's time to remove that fence pole from our behinds and make the final call. And with that, between the Game Gear and Game Boy, the better system is the Game Boy. Leave your hate in the comments, buddy. We just made history. Sorry, the Game Boy is better. I know it, you know it. Now the rest of the internet knows it. For the success of the Game Boy over the Game Gear, I think the price point and name recognition was the major driving force in getting such a clean win. It helped the system perform better commercially, which in turn motivated developers to create more interesting and original games. The Game Gear, with its small, zoomed-in screen and ghosting effect, could not provide a Genesis-level Sonic experience, even with Triple Trouble. And so it felt like there was never a must-own Sonic game. This is an issue that has plagued Sega for multiple consoles. The Game Gear did not have a single ultimate amazing title that was so radical that it drove consumers to buy the more expensive product. The Game Boy had a few of these, with Pokemon at the end driving consumers to buy newer, revised versions of hardware that they already owned. Sega, on the other hand, had a laser focus on making titles that were extremely impressive in the arcade. However, I personally feel like that sometimes came at the expense of making titles that excelled on their consumer hardware. I think that this affected the Saturn and the Dreamcast much more than people realize, but that's a discussion for another video. I absolutely love reading everyone's comments, so please let me know what you think. If you ever had a Game Gear, I'd love to know what your experience was with that. What did people think of the two systems when they were going head to head? If you are from another country, I would find that really exciting to hear what you guys thought of the Game Gear. Also, if there are any other final decisions that you think I need to make, let me know. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to see the latest videos as I release them, with a new one coming at least every Friday. Thanks for watching.